Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to DCC Shop. In this episode, I'm going to be installing battery-powered DCC into a Bachmann large-scale 242T steam locomotive. This is kind of a long one, so I decided to break it into two parts. Part 1 will deal with planning the install, tearing down the engine, and working on the headlights. This is a Bachmann 242T large-scale tank locomotive. My garden railroad doesn't have any track power, so that means the engine needs to carry a battery as well as the DCC equipment. I've already put KD couplers on this locomotive. While I'm doing the DCC install, since I have the thing apart, I'm also going to change a couple of details. The rear footboards that were on the model broke because they were just plastic. I'm going to replace them with a couple of these castings from Ozark Miniatures. I've already drilled some holes in the model to match the holes in the castings. This model also has no backup light, so this is another Ozark Miniatures casting that I've cleaned up. These come a little rough, but they clean up nice. I've drilled a couple of holes in the bottom, one for a screw mount and one for the wires. The casting set also includes this reflector, and I've done my best to polish this so it will actually work. So now I've painted the steps. I'm going to set these aside until the model's further along so I don't damage them while I'm working on it. So here's the new headlight, and I've painted it to resemble the one that's already on the model in the front. It's a little bit smaller, but I think it'll look fine. So this locomotive already has a speaker. It's installed in this fuel bunker area. So I'm going to use this battery. This is an Airwire 14.8 volt, 6.8 amp hour battery. Most of the batteries that I use in large scale are 14.8 volts. They differ in size in terms of the amp hours. So basically the higher the amp hour rating, the longer the battery will last. I think this will probably be pretty good. Most of my other engines will run for hours. So I'm sure, this is a pretty small engine, so I think this battery should be more than adequate. This locomotive isn't very big as far as large-scale engines go, so I think the best bet is going to be to put the battery inside the cab. It's a little unsightly, but I prefer that to having something like a trailer car or something. I just don't really care for that. So this way the engine will be completely self-contained. And this is the Airwire C60X converter. This is basically the receiver that takes the signal from the handheld Airwire controller and converts it to DCC. This is a Loxound 5L decoder. I think this is actually intended for O-scale. Sometimes I'll use one of the XL series decoders for large-scale engines because they're a little bigger. This is a really tiny engine though, and it's not really all that much bigger than an O-scale engine, so I think this should be fine in terms of amp requirements and all that kind of stuff, so I think this will work. Planning the installation is always an important step. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I set up my large-scale locomotives. This is a 4-pole double-throw switch, and the way I'm going to use it, you could think of it as two double-pole double-throw switches that share a common handle. So I've drawn up a little schematic here to try to kind of illustrate what I'm doing. Hopefully this makes it a little clearer. There's the battery and the Airwire receiver. There's a charging jack. There's the DCC decoder, and there's track power, and in the middle of all that is the switch. So the switch basically has two positions, well actually three if you count the center off. When the switch is off, then there's no connections at all within the locomotive, and it's electrically inert, so it just sits there. If you switch the switch to what I think of as the charge position, the battery is connected to the charge jack, and the decoder is connected to track power. So that means at that point I can charge the battery, or I can run the engine on regular DCC powered track, and it will run just like any other DCC powered locomotive. So that's kind of convenient because I don't use track power in the outdoor layout, but it does allow me to use the Loc programmer to program the decoder and load in sounds and all of that, just like I would with any other engine. Also, just for the sake of clarity, I left off the speaker and other wiring connections within the engine like lights and the motor, just to avoid cluttering up the drawing too much. So when you see decoder, that's basically everything in the locomotive except for track power on this diagram. So then the switch has another position, which is the run position, and in that position the battery is connected to the Airwire receiver, and the Airwire receiver in turn is connected to the decoder. So in this case, the power comes from the battery to the Airwire receiver. The Airwire receiver picks up the signal from the handheld controller and then mixes that all together and produces a DCC output that the decoder can recognize, and it runs, as far as the decoder is concerned, it runs just like any other track. So the decoder doesn't know the difference basically between track power and running on the battery. I've used this setup in several models and it works really well, so that's what I'm going to do in this one. So the main things about this then are figuring out where to put all the components. So the Locosound decoder comes with the decoder itself, and then also this mounting board that has a bunch of solder pads on it. So you basically just plug the decoder into this board, and then you can make all your solder connections over here. It's a little more convenient than trying to use these pins directly. This is the AirWire board, has an antenna, and then it's got the input, which comes from the battery, and then the output, which goes to the decoder. So pretty simple to hook these up. So according to the instructions, these 2 screws here, and there's 4 screws here, one's kind of hidden behind the trailing truck, need to be removed to separate the chassis from the body. So I'm going to go ahead and take those screws out. Uh-oh. Well, I'll have to get that one out later. There's a hole in the bottom of the engine and the screw just fell into it. The screwdriver is not very magnetic, so I'll try to grab them. This one got loose but didn't come out, so there it goes. There's also this metal crossbar in here, which needs to be put back in later. Okay, it wants to come out. Oh, there's a whole mess of wires. Okay. So it's a little hard to see, but there is actually an 8-pin DCC plug in here. So if you wanted to use an 8-pin decoder, you could do that. The challenge in here is that there's not a lot of room. This thing is pretty big. I'm kind of trying to decide if I need this at all, if I could just get rid of it. It looks like Bachmann in this case kind of at least somewhat followed the NMRA DCC color coding. So I'm guessing these are track power. These are probably also track power. And then the orange and gray are probably the motor. The rest of this, I'm assuming a couple of these wires are for the light. And I think there might be a smoke unit in here. And there's also some switches in the front, which I don't really care about. I don't care about the smoke either. So I need to think about this to see if I want to keep this board or not. Since there's not a lot of room in this engine, I don't know that I'm really going to have a choice. But I might need to get rid of it. So I have this spare 8-pin to JST harness that I could cut and use to tap into the 8-pin plug if I wanted to. The only thing that bothers me about this is that these wires are really tiny. You know, that's not a big deal in a typical HO scale model. But this is a large scale engine and all the wiring in it is a much heavier gauge than this. So I'm a little concerned about that if I were to try to, keep the factory board in there. So the boiler face of this engine opens and there's 2 switches. One is for polarity. It's NMRA or something else, which I don't really need. And then there's a smoke on and off. And like I said, I don't really care about the smoke either. So I think, if I'm going to abandon the original board, I could probably just ignore these switches and just, cut the wires. So I found out that the entire boiler face pulls off, and there's another circuit board in here where those switches mount that are inside the smoke box door, and also the wires for the headlight. So given the size of the AirWire and Locosound boards that I need to put in here, I just don't think there's room in this thing unless I take the original Bachmann board out. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take all of this other electronics out that I don't really need and just put in the new stuff. So I'm going to unplug some of these wires, get better access. Now I'll undo these screws. So fortunately, Bachmann includes a pretty good wiring diagram. This is the board that I just took out. And I don't need to worry about most of this stuff, but I am glad to know that I was right about the motor and track power connections and the speaker. And then I was wondering about this purple wire, black and purple or whatever it is here, but that's actually some kind of a trigger, probably for chuff sensor. So I don't know if I'll be able to make use of that, but it's good to know what it is. This is the purple and black wire I'm talking about. So that's a trigger, and then the orange and gray wire to the motor, and red and black for track power. I've got 3 different connections. So maybe, I think the front truck, probably the driver's, and I'm not sure about this one if it goes to the rear truck or not. But I'm just going to tie them all together, and you know, that way it'll have plenty of contact points for when I do put it on the programming track. Okay, so the only thing I need to cut here are the headlight wires. And then I should be able to pull this entire thing out. Assuming I can get it past the smoke unit. Oh, maybe not. Maybe it's attached to the smoke unit. Okay. So we'll cut that too. There. The headlight already has an LED, but it's kind of yellowish, and I don't really like the way it looks. It looks like it just pulls out like this. So I want to change the LED inside to a warm white. It looks like there's 2 screws in here that hold in the smoke unit. I'm going to take those out. The loc sound decoder will actually drive the smoke unit, I'm pretty sure, but I just really don't care about them, so I'm just going to get rid of it. Now I need to get the cab apart. It's got a couple of screws at the corners that look like they might be promising. It's a little hard to tell from the exploded view drawings. This, I think, is just a detail. So that can come off. It's in the way of the other screw. Something's still holding it up. Not sure what. So it looks like some of these plumbing details actually include pieces of wire that stick through the cab, so they need to be taken off as well. It's a little hard to see, but the screws that hold this detail part on are very tiny. So there's starting to be a lot of little screws, so what I'm doing is trying to wrap them to keep them with the part they go to, and that way hopefully I won't lose them later. So the cab's almost coming off. There's still some wire that's holding it, along with this cord that goes to the whistle and the bell. So I don't know what I'm going to do with that right now. So this piece of wire, it's supposed to be a pipe. It goes all the way from this piece all the way into the cab, and it's kind of not really wanting to, moves a little bit. There's a kind of a strap holding this down with some really tiny screws. I'm going to loosen it and see if I can maybe finagle this wire out of here. Ah, there we go. All right. I'm going to go ahead and put these screws back in just so I don't lose them, because they're super tiny. So now the problem is this piece of string. So I think I'm just going to cut it, because I don't really see any other option here. Maybe cut it with something better than this. There we go. All right. Have to replace that with something else later. And now the cab comes off. Yay. And here is the speaker that actually is built in. You can see right away one of the wires is disconnected. So I'm going to have to do something about that. So the idea with this, I guess, is that this fits in here on the floor. It's got a couple of screws. This was actually, it's been loose since I bought the engine, so it's never really been in properly. But I think the idea is that this turns the entire fuel bunker area into a baffle for the speaker. So I don't know what kind of a speaker this is, but I don't really have a replacement, so I'm probably just going to go ahead and use it. It is an 8 ohm 1 watt speaker, so that should be fine for the Loc Sound decoder. And the battery, yeah, that'll fit perfectly. So that'll be good. It does maybe block the speaker a little, but hopefully that won't be too much of a problem. There is some airspace there. While I have the cab apart, I'm going to unscrew the coal load, because eventually I want to turn this into an oil burner. Not too worried about the details right now, but I can at least get rid of the coal load so it's not in the way. I had to pull off these railings, or whatever they are, grab irons, that were in the back here to actually get the coal load off. And now it's got 3 holes in it, which isn't going to be good for the speaker enclosure, so I'm going to have to do something with that. So I wasn't going to do anything about this, but then I realized I needed to do something to plug the holes in the fuel bunker where I took the coal load out. So I built this little fuel bunker to fit on top. And this is another Ozark Miniatures casting, and the rest of it is just built up from pieces of styrene. So now it's time to start putting the engine back together. I've painted the fuel bunker and glued it in place on the back of the cab. Now I can reinstall these railings. So with the railings reinstalled, I don't think this looks too bad. I don't need these screw holes where the coal load was fastened down anymore, so I'm going to seal them up with some silicone just to make sure they're airtight, because this is part of the speaker enclosure and I want it to be as airtight as possible for the best sound. While the silicone in the cab is drying, I'm going to switch gears and work on the lights. Pull this mount off. I want to try to open this headlight up, and oh, I just broke that. All right, I'm going to have to fix that. But I want to get it apart so that I can change the LED. There's no way to open this, so you just have to push the headlight out with the screwdriver, sticking it in through the hole in the bottom. And then I can just remove the original LED, which I said before was kind of yellowish. I didn't really like it. I'll keep the reflector. These are 3mm warm white LEDs. I'm going to use one of these in each headlight. I'm going to clip the leads a little shorter. If you look inside the LED, there's a couple of metal pieces. The smaller one is the positive, and that should go to the blue wire. And the larger one is the negative, and that should go to your function lead from the decoder. I like to use some sprung tweezers to hold the LED while I'm soldering it. I'm just tinning the leads. Makes it a little easier. Along with the LEDs, I'll also use some 750 ohm resistors. It's totally my own preference, but I like to solder the resistor to the negative side of the LED. So now I've finished soldering wires to each LED. It's usually best practice to use 1 resistor per LED. The last step is to use some heat shrink tubing to make sure that the connections are insulated. It's a good idea to test the LEDs and make sure they work too. I followed the normal DCC conventions and used white wire for the front headlight and yellow wire for the rear headlight. These are now ready to go. I had to file the opening a little bit to get the new LED to fit, but I went ahead and glued it in the back of the reflector. And I also bent the leads a little bit so that it'll fit into the headlight casting. I did the same thing in the rear, and I used canopy glue to secure the LED inside the hole. Before I put the rear headlight together, I need to drill a couple of holes in the roof, because that's where I want to mount it, on the back of the cab. So I want to take a little rubbing to make a template so I can figure out how to space the holes. So I transferred the pattern onto the paper. I drilled these holes myself, and they're not any specific distance apart. One is tapped for a 256 screw and the other one's just open, so I have a place to run the wires. So I put some tape on the cab to protect it, and then I made a line here for the center line. Had to do a little bit of careful measuring to figure out exactly where that was. And then I also made another mark that shows where the back of the headlight casting should be approximately. I've cut my piece of paper down to also approximate the size of the headlight casting so that the back of the casting is here. That way I can line it up with this mark up here. Alright, so I've taped the paper to the roof in the place where it should go, and now I'm going to start drilling, and it should end up in the right place. I like to use a pin vise for stuff like this so that I don't go too fast. I don't want to risk melting the plastic. It's pretty easy to drill through plastic anyway. I don't know how well this shows up on camera, but this one hole is about as close to the wall as I could get without actually drilling into the back wall. So I got kind of lucky there. Now that I have all the holes drilled, I can finish setting up the headlight. I'm using some canopy glue as an adhesive. This will dry totally clear. So I've threaded the wires through one of the holes, and I just need to put the reflector in there. So this is what it looks like with the reflector installed. I actually ended up having to do this twice, and I had to remove the resistor to get it all to fit. So I'm going to have to put the resistor somewhere else. Ozark Miniatures includes some glazing for the casting with the headlight. I'm going to use some canopy glue to install the glazing. This is kind of what canopy glue was made for. It'll dry perfectly clear and you won't see it. So I'm going to feed the wires through the closer hole. I put the screw through the other hole. And now the engine has a backup light. Like, test it again just to make sure. Looks good. I made this simple tester for LEDs. It's just a 9-volt battery holder, a couple of alligator clips, and one of the leads has a resistor on it. So with this I can hook up the LEDs like I did with the headlight and just make sure everything's working right. So the front headlight works too. Everything's exactly the same with this one, except because the casting is a little bit bigger, I was able to leave the resistor on it. So now I can reattach the mount. And the wires are fed through where the original wires were fed through. I'm going to leave it here for now. Next time we'll pick it up and install the rest of the components into the engine, load sounds into the sound decoder, and test it out on the garden layout. If you like this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.